This prison has a notorious history, with stories of violence, suffering, and even murder within its walls. It's a place where the living are not welcome, and the spirits of the dead are said to roam free. The challenge of understanding the phenomena that occur in this prison is a daunting one. How can we explain the unexplained noises, the apparitions, and the feelings of unease that permeate every corner of this foreboding place? Many have tried to uncover the secrets of this prison, but few have succeeded. The truth is, we may never fully comprehend the mysteries that surround us. Despite the many investigations that have taken place, the prison remains a place of dark wonder, where the unknown lurks around every corner. It's a place where the rational and the irrational coexist, where science and superstition blend together in a swirling vortex of fear and uncertainty. Theories abound, from electromagnetic fields to psychological explanations, but ultimately, they all fall short of providing a complete answer to the question that haunts us all. What lies beyond the veil of the unknown? We can only scratch the surface of this enigma, leaving us with more questions than answers. In this prison, the veil between the worlds is thin, and the spirits of the dead are said to linger, trapped between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. It's a place where time stands still, where the past, present, and future converge, and where the living are forced to confront the darkness that lies within themselves. From the eerie whispers in the darkness to the disembodied voices that echo through the corridors, the stories associated with this prison are as chilling as they are fascinating. Eyewitness accounts speak of ghostly apparitions, unexplained noises, and an overwhelming feeling of malevolent presence. Paranormal investigations have captured evidence of the paranormal, from orbs to EVPs, but the question remains: what lies behind these manifestations? One of the most haunting stories associated with this prison is that of a former inmate who died under mysterious circumstances. His spirit is said to haunt the cells, reliving the agony of his final moments. Many have reported seeing his ghostly apparition, wandering the corridors, searching for a way to escape the hellish existence that was his life. Others have heard his whispers in the darkness, a faint cry for help that echoes through eternity. But there's one story that stands out above the rest, a story that will send chills down your spine and make you question the very fabric of reality. It's a story of a group of paranormal investigators who ventured into the prison, seeking to uncover the secrets of the unknown. What they captured was beyond anything they could have imagined, a turning point in the narrative that will leave you breathless. The evidence they captured was undeniable, a manifestation of the paranormal that defied explanation. It was as if the spirits of the dead had finally found a way to communicate with the living, to convey a message that would haunt us all. The footage they captured is still widely debated today, with many claiming it to be one of the most compelling pieces of paranormal evidence ever recorded. As we reflect on the stories we've heard, it's clear that this prison is a place of dark magic, where the forces of the unknown hold sway. The spirits that linger within its walls are a testament to the power of the human psyche, a reminder that even in death, our presence can still be felt. Join me next time as we explore more haunted locations, and don't forget to share your own ghost stories in the comments below. Until then, farewell, and may the spirits of the dead leave you be.
Part 1. The first night inside. I don't know what brought me to this place. Maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity. But the moment the iron gates slammed shut behind me, I knew I'd made a mistake. Stone walls towered over us, their rough surfaces scarred with time and misery. You could feel the centuries of suffering ingrained in every crack. It was thick in the air, like humidity that clung to the skin, except it wasn't water. It was fear. I was part of a team of 5. We called ourselves paranormal investigators, but really, we were just a bunch of thrill seekers with cameras and voice recorders. Greg, the skeptic of the group, always insisted ghosts were just tricks of the mind. Katie had a way with tech, patching our equipment together from eBay finds and thrift store treasures. Marcus, our camera guy, liked to act tough, but his hands shook every time we stepped into a place like this. Then there was Sarah, our medium. She said she didn't see ghosts, only felt them, like static pressing against her skin. And then there was me, Nathan, the idiot who thought spending the night in the abandoned Penwell prison would be a fun way to spend a weekend. That place had had a reputation. Built in the 1800s, it closed after a string of violent inmate riots and unexplained deaths. 3 guards were murdered, their bodies found mutilated in the mess hall. An inmate was discovered hanging in his cell, except it wasn't suicide. His limbs had been twisted into angles no human body could achieve. They never found who did it. And there were the stories. Tales of prisoners whispering secrets to things no one could see. Guards who quit, claiming they were followed by shadows that whispered their names at night. And then there were the disappearances, prisoners that simply vanished without a trace from locked cells. When we first stood in front of the main gate, Marcus joked about how we'd finally get footage that would make us YouTube stars. No one laughed. We'd been in creepy places before, but Pinwell was different. It wasn't just a ruin. It was alive in the worst way. The air around it pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and heavy. As if the prison wasn't just a building, it was something waiting. We stepped through the gate at 9:03 p.m. That was the first thing that fell off the time. 9:03 exactly. The kind of detail you wouldn't notice unless you were paying attention, but it sank into my mind and settled there like a splinter. The metal gate groaned shut behind us, the sound echoing down the prison's long, empty halls. There was a sense that we had passed a boundary, not just a physical one, but something deeper, something final. "We'll set up in the old infirmary," Katie said, already adjusting the straps of her equipment bag. "It has the best acoustics." "You mean it has the best chance of catching a ghost moaning?" Marcus teased, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. The infirmary was the stuff of nightmares. Rusted hospital beds stood crooked in the dim light, some tipped over as if abandoned in a panic. An ancient wheelchair sat in the corner, facing the wall. I swear it hadn't been there the first time I looked. The walls were stained with things that looked suspiciously like blood, and the smell of antiseptic still lingered, even though no one had stepped foot in this place for over 40 years. As we unpacked the equipment, I noticed Sarah standing very still by the doorway, her hand clenched around a pendant she always wore. She was staring into the hallway, her lips moving, but no sound came out. "Sarah," I called softly. "You good?" Her head jerked towards me, eyes wide. "There's something," she whispered. "Something wrong with the air here." "You always say that," Greg scoffed, slapping a battery into one of the recorders. "It's an abandoned building. Of course the air feels weird." "No," Sarah shook her head slowly. "This place remembers. It doesn't want us here." Before I could say anything, Katie turned on the cameras, flooding the room with the mechanical hum of our equipment. "All right," she said, "let's catch some ghosts." The first anomaly happened almost immediately. Katie's thermal camera flickered, then displayed a patch of ice-cold air in the middle of the room, right where Sarah had been standing earlier. It was perfectly round, like a human figure frozen in time. I saw Marcus zoom in on it with his handheld camera, but before he could get a clear shot, the cold spot vanished. Not faded, vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. "Did anyone else feel that?" Marcus asked, his voice low. "Like something just passed through me." Sarah looked at him sharply. "Don't say things like that. It hears you." "Who hears me?" Marcus smirked, but there was no confidence in his voice. Sarah just stared at him, her face pale. We decided to split up. It wasn't the smartest move, but we wanted to cover as much ground as possible. Marcus and I stayed in the infirmary while Greg and Katie went to the solitary confinement wing. Sarah stayed at the central hub, watching the monitors. "Keep the walkie-talkies on channel 2, Katie instructed. "And don't." Her voice cut off mid-sentence. I turned to look at her, but she wasn't there anymore. None of us saw her leave the room. "Guys," Marcus called, his voice breaking. "Where's Katie?" We all looked at each other, confusion quickly turning into panic. Then the static on the walkie-talkie crackled. "Katie!" Greg's voice came through, sharp and clear. "What the hell are you doing down here?" Our walkie-talkie buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Greg's voice. It was Katie's. "I'm still in the infirmary," she whispered. "I never left." Marcus and I stared at each other. The walkie in my hand was still transmitting, but Greg's voice didn't return. Then, from somewhere deep in the prison, we heard a scream. It was distant, distorted by the walls, but unmistakably human. Marcus dropped the camera. "Tell me you heard that." I didn't answer. I was too busy staring at the wheelchair in the corner. It was no longer facing the wall. It was facing us. Part 2. The Solitary Wing. I've been to places that felt haunted before. Old houses, abandoned hospitals, but nothing compared to the solitary confinement wing. It wasn't just the darkness or the silence. It was the feeling that the walls themselves were watching us, listening. As Marcus and I grabbed our gear to follow Katie's voice, the air felt thicker, heavier. It pressed against my skin, making it hard to breathe. We hurried through the narrow corridors, the beam of our flashlight flickering across iron bars and peeling paint. The prison seemed to groan around us, as if the entire building was shifting, stretching its bones after lying dormant for years. "Katie," Marcus called again into the walkie. Static was the only reply. His hands shook as he gripped the flashlight tighter. Then from up ahead, we heard it. A voice, faint and distant, but unmistakably Katie's. She was whispering something, over and over. It echoed off the walls like a prayer or a warning. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate, as if she was pleading with someone, or something. We rounded the corner and saw her at the end of the corridor. She stood in front of an open cell, her back to us, swaying slightly on her feet. The flashlight's beam illuminated her pale skin, making her look like a ghost herself. I swear she wasn't breathing. "Katie," I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls. She didn't move. Marcus stepped forward cautiously, holding the camera up. "Katie, what the hell are you doing?" Without warning, she turned to us. But it wasn't a normal turn. It was a jerk, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and vacant. For a moment, she just stared, mouth slightly open, as if she'd forgotten how to speak. Then, in a voice that was not her own, she whispered, "It's awake." Before we could react, Katie stumbled forward, collapsing into Marcus's arms. I rushed over and helped lower her to the ground. Her body was ice cold, her lips blue, and her pulse barely there. But she was breathing, shallow and ragged. "What the hell happened?" Marcus muttered, his voice trembling. Katie's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief second, they didn't look like her eyes. They were wrong, darker, like something else was looking out from inside her. Then she blinked, and just like that, she was herself again. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I was in the infirmary, and then I wasn't." "You were standing right here," I said, glancing nervously at the open cell behind her. "What did you see?" Katie shook her head slowly. "It's all blank, like I blacked out." Marcus helped her to her feet, and as we stood there, the walkie-talkie in my hand crackled again. Greg's voice came through, frantic. "Nathan, get out of there. Now." "What?" I pressed the button. "What's going on?" "It's coming, just get out." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and then went out entirely. We were plunged into complete darkness, the kind that claws at your mind and fills it with things you don't want to imagine. Marcus cursed under his breath, fumbling with the flashlight. When he finally got it working, the beam landed on the open cell. And that's when we saw it, a figure crouched in the corner. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, as if it didn't fit inside its body. The eyes, milky and unblinking, reflected the flashlight like an animal's in the dark. It smiled. The grin was impossibly wide, exposing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. It didn't move, but the smile alone was enough to root me in place, as if my limbs had been turned to stone. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't. Then it moved. It unfolded itself from the corner in one grotesque, fluid motion, like a spider unfurling its legs. Marcus screamed. Katie grabbed my arm, snapping me out of the trance. "We need to go? Now!" We bolted, sprinting back the way we came, our footsteps echoing down the corridor. The thing followed, its footsteps mismatched, as if it had too many legs or not enough. The sound was wrong, offbeat, like someone dragging a heavy sack behind them. The air grew colder with every step, our breath visible in the flashlight beam as we ran. "Where's Greg?" Marcus shouted between gasps. "I don't know." Katie cried. He was supposed to be with me, but a deafening clang cut her off as one of the cell doors slammed shut behind us. We didn't stop to look. We just kept running, hearts hammering in our chests. The thing was gaining on us, its footsteps echoing louder, closer. And then, just as we reached the door to the infirmary, it stopped. We skidded to a halt, gasping for air, and turned around. The corridor was empty. There was no sign of the figure, no sound of footsteps, nothing but silence. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered, still clutching the camera. "I don't know," Katie muttered, wiping sweat from her brow. "But it's not done with us." We stood there in the silence, catching our breath, when Greg's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie again. Guys, his voice was faint, barely audible over the static. "I think I'm lost." My stomach dropped. "Greg, where are you?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. There was a pause. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, Greg said, "I don't know. It's so dark." Marcus raised the walkie to his mouth. "Stay where you are, man. We'll come find you." But before we could move, Greg's voice came through again, low and shaky. "There's something down here with me." Part 3. The Whispering Walls. The prison was awake now. You could feel it like a low hum vibrating through the walls and the floors inside your skull. Something ancient and malevolent had stirred, and it wasn't about to let us go. We had no choice but to search for Greg. Leaving him alone in this place wasn't an option, even if it meant risking our own lives. Katie gripped her walkie, so hard her knuckles turned white, as if holding onto it might somehow keep Greg anchored in reality. Marcus kept adjusting the camera, even though I was certain the footage we were capturing wasn't going to save us. We decided to head toward the lower levels, where solitary gave way to maximum security cells. The air felt even thicker down there, and colder. Every breath stung our lungs like winter wind, and a damp, moldy smell clung to everything. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the prison had veins beneath the surface, carrying the memories of everything that had died within its confines. "Greg, keep talking," Katie whispered into the walkie, her voice trembling. "We're coming to find you." A burst of static hissed from the speaker. Then, faintly, we heard Greg's voice again. "It's so cold down here," he whispered. "I think I'm in one of the old cell blocks. But something is wrong with the walls. They're moving." "Stay where you are?" Marcus barked, trying to mask the panic creeping into his voice. "We'll get to you, just stay calm, all right?" More static, then Greg's voice again, barely audible. "There's someone whispering, right behind me." We sprinted down the narrow corridor, the air growing colder with every step. Our flashlights flickered, the beams stuttering like a dying heartbeat. The building groaned around us, the ancient pipes creaking as if something enormous was shifting beneath the floors. Then we heard it. Whispers. Low, frantic murmurs coming from all directions. Too many voices to make out, overlapping in an endless, incomprehensible chorus. It was as if the walls were speaking, recounting every secret, every betrayal, every death that had ever happened here. "I don't like this," Marcus muttered, glancing nervously at the walls. "It's like they're alive." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. My skin prickled as words began to form within the noise. Half-sentences, fragments of thoughts, like memories clawing their way to the surface. "He deserved it. No one saw. You'll never leave." Katie's flashlight flickered violently, and for a moment, it illuminated a figure standing at the end of the corridor. It was Greg, or at least, it looked like Greg. "Greg!" I shouted, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there, perfectly still, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Why isn't he saying anything?" Marcus whispered, gripping my shoulder. We approached slowly, the beam of my flashlight locked on the figure. As we drew closer, my heart sank into my stomach. It wasn't Greg. It was something wearing his face, its features slightly off, as if they'd been copied and pasted onto the wrong body. Its eyes were vacant, lifeless. And its mouth, it was too wide, stretched into a grin that didn't belong to any living thing. Then it spoke. "Why did you come here?" It whispered, the voice rasping like dry leaves. "Don't you know? What waits for you?" The grin widened, impossibly, grotesquely. Then, with a sickening crack, the figure folded into itself, collapsing into a heap on the floor like a discarded puppet. Katie screamed, stumbling backward, and I had to grab her arm to keep her from falling. Marcus swore under his breath, pulling the camera closer to his chest as if it could shield him from the nightmare unfolding around us. "We need to get out of here," Katie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. This isn't right. "We can't leave without Greg," I said, though every fiber of my being wanted to bolt for the exit. Marcus knelt by the crumpled figure, shining his flashlight over the twisted body. It didn't move. Whatever it was, or whoever it had once been, it was no longer alive. Then, from the darkness ahead, we heard Greg's voice again. "Guys, it's behind you." We spun around, our flashlights cutting through the black. For a moment, everything was still too still. Then we saw it, a shadow moving along the wall, slithering like smoke. It wasn't attached to any person or object. It moved independently, gliding along the stone surface like a living thing. It was hunting us. Katie clutched her pendant, muttering a prayer under her breath. Marcus raised the camera, capturing the shifting shadow as it twisted and coiled along the wall. The shadow whispered as it moved, low, mocking murmurs that seemed to burrow into our minds. "You can't hide. It knows your name. Come closer. Let it in." I felt a chill crawl down my spine as the shadow slithered closer, its shape shifting and distorting. It stretched along the wall, growing longer and wider until it loomed over us like a tidal wave of darkness. Then it stopped, hovering just inches from us, as if waiting. And that's when the doors began to slam. One by one, the cell doors on either side of the corridor crashed shut with deafening force. The sound echoed through the prison, a metallic symphony of dread. Each slam felt like a countdown, like the building itself was preparing to swallow us whole. "We need to move," Marcus shouted, grabbing my arm. We ran, deeper into the labyrinth of cells, with no plan, no direction, only the desperate need to escape whatever was following us. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air thick with whispers and the sound of unseen footsteps. And then, just as we rounded a corner, we saw him. Greg. He was slumped against the wall, pale and trembling, his clothes soaked with sweat. His eyes were wide with terror, locked onto something only he could see. "Greg!" I skidded to a stop and knelt beside him. "What the hell happened? Are you hurt?" Greg's lips moved, but no sound came out. He clutched at my shirt, his fingers ice cold. It followed me," he whispered finally. "It won't let us leave." Katie knelt beside me, her hand on Greg's shoulder. "What did you see?" Greg shook his head violently, as if the memory was too horrible to speak aloud. "It's inside the walls," he muttered. "It knows we're here. It wants us." Before we could ask anything else, the shadow slithered around the corner, blocking our only exit. It reared up, a mass of writhing black tendrils, and whispered, "You're already dead." Part 4. The Sacrifice. We stood frozen, backs against the cold stone wall as the shadow loomed before us, writhing like a nest of serpents. It whispered promises of suffering, the sound slithering into our ears like a poison we couldn't unhear. Greg clutched my sleeve, his nails digging into my arm. "We won't get out," he rasped. "No one ever does." "We're not giving up," I whispered back, though my own voice felt like a lie. The shadow hovered, waiting, as if it was giving us time to think about what it would do to us. "We need to move," Marcus said, panic rising in his throat. "We need to fucking run." "There's no running from this," Greg muttered, sinking lower to the floor. His eyes were glassy, filled with something that looked an awful lot like acceptance. "We're already in its trap." And that's when I saw it, the glimmer of movement out of the corner of my eye. A sliver of light slicing through the darkness from further down the corridor. A door just barely ajar. "There!" I shouted. "Go!" I grabbed Greg by the arm and pulled him to his feet. Marcus and Katie sprinted ahead, their footsteps slapping against the concrete as we raced towards the door. The shadow hissed, surging after us like a wave of ink spreading across the walls. We barely made it. The door slammed shut behind us with a metallic clang, sealing the darkness outside. For a moment, All we could hear was the sound of our own ragged breathing, echoing in the confined space. Then we looked around, and my heart dropped into my stomach. We were inside a chapel. The room was small, barely more than a closet. Dust-covered pews lined the walls, and at the far end, a crumbling stone altar stood beneath a broken stained glass window. The window depicted an angel with hollow eyes and wings that looked more like claws. Katie stepped forward, brushing cobwebs off the altar. Her flashlight beam landed on something carved deep into the stone. Names. Dozens of them. Some were scratched out, others half erased, but all were there, etched into the stone as if they were meant to be remembered. This isn't just a chapel," she whispered. "It's a memorial." Marcus ran the camera over the names, capturing the eerie carvings. "What the hell does it mean?" Greg stared at the altar, his face pale. "Those are the ones who didn't make it." I felt my stomach turn. "You mean?" He nodded. "Every inmate, every guard who vanished, their names are here. They were sacrifices." Katie stumbled back, her hand pressed to her mouth. "This place, it's alive, isn't it? It's been feeding on them." Greg sat down heavily on one of the pews, running his hands through his hair. "It doesn't just kill you. It uses you. Every soul that dies here becomes part of it. It's how it survives." As his words settled over us like a death sentence, I realized the horrifying truth. The prison wasn't haunted by individual ghosts. It was one massive entity, a living organism made up of the spirits it had consumed. And now it wanted us. Katie paced in a tight circle, panic bleeding into her movements. "We have to get out of here. There has to be a way out." "There is no way out," Greg muttered. "Not unless we give it what it wants." Marcus lowered the camera, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" Greg looked up slowly, his face a mask of despair. "The prison doesn't let anyone leave unless it gets another sacrifice." The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around our necks. A heavy silence fell over the room as we processed what Greg had just said. The truth of it was undeniable. Every disappearance, every unexplained death, all part of a cycle the prison demanded. And now it was our turn. "No," Katie whispered, shaking her head. "No, we're not doing that. We're not killing someone." Marcus stared at Greg with mounting anger. "You knew, didn't you? You fucking knew this whole time." "I didn't want to believe it." Greg shot back, tears streaming down his face. "I thought if we stuck together, we could find another way." "There is no other way," Marcus hissed, stepping toward Greg. "You brought us here knowing this would happen." Before I could stop him, Marcus grabbed Greg by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Greg didn't even fight back. He just hung there, limp and broken, like a man who'd already given up. "Enough!" I shouted, pulling Marcus away. "Fighting won't get us out of here." Marcus shook me off, his eyes wild with fear and fury. "So what do we do, huh? Wait here until it eats us alive." Katie collapsed onto one of the pews, clutching her pendant like a lifeline. "There's got to be another way," she whispered. We can't just sacrifice someone." Greg wiped his face with the back of his hand. "We don't have to." Marcus turned on him. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Greg took a shaky breath. "One of us just has to stay." The room went deathly silent. Katie's eyes widened with horror. "No, no way. It's the only way," Greg insisted. "One of us stays behind, and the others can leave." I felt like I was going to be sick. The idea of leaving someone behind to this thing, it was unthinkable. But so was the alternative, none of us making it out alive. Marcus paced furiously, running his hands through his hair. "This is bullshit. This whole thing is bullshit. There's no other choice," Greg whispered. "You know that." We sat in that chapel for what felt like hours, the weight of the decision crushing us. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the truth was clear. One of us wasn't going to leave. "I'll do it," Greg said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady now, as if he'd made peace with his fate. "I brought you all here. This is my fault. I should be the one to stay." "No," Katie whispered, tears in her eyes. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Greg said softly. "If you don't leave now, none of us will." I wanted to argue, to tell him there was another solution, but deep down I knew he was right. The prison had already marked him. It wouldn't let go until it had what it wanted. Marcus cursed under his breath, punching the wall in frustration. This is so fucked. Katie knelt in front of Greg, tears streaming down her face. We'll come back for you, she whispered. I swear we will. Greg smiled sadly. Don't make promises you can't keep. We stood at the door, the weight of the sacrifice hanging heavy between us. Greg gave us a small, tired smile, one that spoke of acceptance and resignation. Go, he whispered, before it changes its mind. We didn't want to leave him, but we had no choice. Part 5. The Last Sacrifice. We left Greg behind in the chapel. Every step toward the exit felt like betrayal, like we were carrying his soul with us, dragging it away from the light. But there was no other way. He'd told us to run, and if we hesitated, even for a second, the prison would devour us all. The corridors felt tighter as we ran, as if the walls were closing in. The whispers were everywhere, louder now, overlapping into a maddening storm of voices. Some begged, some laughed, others screamed. The building seemed to pulse with life, each groan of the walls a heartbeat counting down to our doom. Katie sobbed as she sprinted beside me, clutching her pendant like it could ward off the darkness. Marcus ran ahead, flashlight beam bobbing wildly. No one spoke. We knew if we stopped moving, we wouldn't move again. We burst into the main hallway, the exit in sight, those massive iron gates that had sealed us inside hours ago. They stood slightly ajar now, as if inviting us to leave. And that's when it happened. The gate began to close. No! Marcus shouted, barreling toward the shrinking gap. He slammed into the gate with all his weight, jamming his shoulder between the bars to keep it from shutting completely. Help me, he yelled, teeth gritted in pain. Katie and I rushed to his side, shoving against the gate with everything we had. The metal groaned under the pressure, but it wasn't enough. The gap was narrowing inch by inch, driven by some unseen force. It was like the prison itself was determined to trap us forever. We can't let it close. Katie screamed, tears streaming down her face. Just as the gap shrank too small for Marcus to squeeze through, he shoved his backpack between the bars. The gate caught on the bag, stopping it for now. Move! Go through! Marcus yelled. I'll hold it! Katie crawled through the gap first, her small frame just barely making it past the bars. She turned, reaching back for me. Come on, Nathan. I looked at Marcus. You too. We're not leaving you here. He shook his head, sweat dripping down his brow. If I move, it closes. You have to go. No. I shouted, panic gripping my chest. We're not leaving you behind. You have to. Marcus roared, his eyes wild with desperation. I'll be right behind you. Just go. Katie tugged on my arm. Nathan, please. I stared at Marcus, heart hammering. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with something I couldn't name, something final. Go, he whispered. Don't make Greg's sacrifice meaningless. With a wrenching sob, I forced myself to crawl through the gap. Katie grabbed my arm and hauled me to my feet on the other side. Marcus, she cried. Come on. He gave us one last strained smile. See you on the other side. Then, with a sharp tug, he yanked his backpack free, and the gate slammed shut with a deafening clang. No! Katie screamed, throwing herself against the bars. We pounded on the gate, screaming Marcus's name, but it was no use. The gate was sealed, and he was trapped on the other side. For a long moment, the only sound was our ragged breathing. Then, from the darkness beyond the gate, we heard Marcus's voice, calm, almost resigned. It's okay, he whispered. It's over now. No, Katie sobbed, slamming her fists against the bars. We'll come back for you, Marcus. I swear. But before she could finish, the shadows behind him shifted. A figure emerged from the darkness, a twisted, hulking shape that moved like smoke and bone. It loomed behind Marcus, tendrils coiling around him like a serpent. Marcus! I shouted, my voice raw. Run! He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us through the bars with a sad, knowing smile. I guess it was always going to end this way, he whispered. Then the shadow swallowed him whole. Katie collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. I sank beside her, my hands trembling. We'd escaped the prison, but not all of us. After a long, agonizing moment, I pulled Katie to her feet. "We have to go," I whispered. "We have to." She nodded weakly, wiping her eyes. Together, we stumbled away from the gate, the prison looming behind us like a silent predator. As we made our way down the overgrown path toward the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The air was heavy with the weight of unfinished business. When we reached the edge of the prison grounds, Katie paused, glancing back at the towering walls. "Do you think Marcus and Greg are still in there?" she whispered. I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to say they were free, at peace, somewhere beyond the reach of the prison's darkness. But I knew better. "They'll always be there," I whispered, "just like the others." Katie nodded slowly, her eyes hollow with grief. "It's never really over, is it?" "No," I said quietly. "It's not." As we walked down the empty road, the prison stood behind us, silent and waiting. It had taken what it wanted for now, but I knew, deep in my bones, that it would call again. It always did, and when it did, someone else would walk through those gates. Someone else would listen to the whispers, feel the walls close in, and face the same impossible choice we had. Because that's the truth about places like Penwell Prison. They don't just hold the dead. They become them. And once you step inside, you never really leave. End of the story. The nightmare is over for now, but the prison remains, waiting for the next soul to stumble inside. Would you dare to return?